Imagine a world where you could conquer half the globe, command legions, and reshape history, but you'd still get slapped with a life-altering fine for wearing the wrong shade of violet or sobbing too loudly at your grandmother's funeral. Welcome to ancient Rome, a civilization that viewed your personal choices not as self-expression, but as potential threats to national security. Before we dive into the high-stakes world of Roman social engineering, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you're genuinely into uncovering the weird, gritty reality of the past. Also, drop a comment below, where are you watching from, and what's the time? I love seeing how far our digital empire stretches. In the modern world, fashion is an art form. In Rome, fashion was a warning system. Specifically, the color purple wasn't just a style choice, it was a loud, aggressive broadcast of how much trouble you could legally cause. The legendary Tyrion purple was the ultimate flex. It was made by crushing tens of thousands of tiny predatory sea snails, each yielding a single microscopic drop of pigment. The process was grueling, smelled like rotting fish, and required trade routes that spanned the entire Mediterranean. To wear a purple toga was to say, I possess resources you will never emotionally recover from. Naturally, the state stepped in. They realized that if everyone could wear purple, the social hierarchy would collapse into chaos. Only emperors and high-ranking officials could sport the full snail drip. The practicality: Rome had no ID cards or LinkedIn profiles. You needed instant visual clarity. The prison speed run, wearing unauthorized purple, was essentially identity fraud with sandals. It wasn't a fashion faux pas, it was a capital offense. Which prestige ingredients, like certain shellfish or sow's udders, were off-limits. Rome understood that clear hierarchy prevents arguments, and arguments turn into violence. By policing what you wore, how you cried, and what you ate, the state wasn't just being petty, it was trying to keep the world's most volatile superpower from imploding under the weight of its own ego. Senators in the late Republic were essentially the original lifestyle influencers, but with significantly more blood on their hands. They bankrupted themselves trying to maintain a curated image of ultimate power, then desperately tried to recover their finances through bribery, systemic corruption, and occasionally, just for a little spice, lightly destabilizing the entire state. Rome had already seen this movie, and it absolutely hated the ending. So, the government stepped in with a firm. You may host a dinner, but it will be a reasonable dinner. These were the Sumptuary laws, and they were Rome's attempt to stop the elite from spiraling into a toxic status addiction. Rome literally told its citizens to calm down with the luxury ingredients. There were hard limits on meat consumption, the number of guests you could invite, and how much gold you could display on your table. This wasn't about protecting the poor from the cringe of seeing wealth. It was about protecting the state from elite stupidity. Political stability: when powerful families competed socially, alliances fractured, debts mounted, and politics turned radioactive. Rome knew that the fastest way to destroy a republic was to let its leaders become addicted to outflexing each other. The softness factor: there was a moral angle, too. Excessive luxury was seen as a character flaw. In the Roman mind, soft men made bad leaders, and nothing screamed unfit for command like needing a 7-course meal featuring peacock tongues just to feel important. Before we explore the high-stakes bureaucracy of Roman death and the strange legal status of its superstars, remember to like and subscribe. We're building a community of history fanatics here, and I want to know, if you lived in Rome, would you be a law-abiding citizen or a loophole-finding rebel? Let me know in the comments. In ancient Rome, nighttime wasn't romantic, it was a shift for criminals and conspiracies. Rome assumed you were guilty until the sun proved otherwise. Most assassinations, political ambushes, and secret meetings happened in the dark, and the state responded by effectively discouraging movement altogether. Pattern recognition: Rome knew that fires, the city's greatest fear, started at night. By limiting movement, they could easily spot who was responsible for an accidental blaze. The no loitering policy: if you were out, you needed a reason: work, emergency, or official business. Clearing your head wasn't a valid excuse. The equality of darkness: even the elite weren't safe. Senators moved with small armies of escorts because they knew the night equalized everyone. Rome preferred to be rude to innocent people than to be surprised by a riot. This is the part that usually shocks modern readers. In Rome, suicide wasn't automatically illegal, but spontaneous self-destruction was a bureaucratic nightmare. If you wanted to end your life, you were expected to submit a formal request to the authorities. The web of obligations: every citizen was a gear in the Roman machine. You had debts, heirs, and political alliances. If you died suddenly, you left a trail of legal chaos. Filter for impulsivity: by requiring a petition, the state added a cooling-off period. Delay led to reflection, and reflection saved lives. If your reason was terminal illness or loss of honor, the state might say yes. If it was, "I had a bad week," the answer was a firm no. Finally, understand that for a Roman, religion wasn't a feeling, it was a transactional contract. If you failed to perform a ritual correctly, you weren't just a sinner, you were a threat to public safety. If the gods got angry because you messed up a prayer, the whole city paid the price. In Rome, piety wasn't about your heart, it was about your precision. In ancient Rome, the gods didn't care about your heart, and your neighbors didn't care about your authentic self. They cared about results. Rome operated on the belief that personal behavior never stays personal for long, it leaks, spreads, and eventually manifests as a public crisis. To a Roman, the state wasn't just a government, it was a constant presence in your bedroom, your temple, and your funeral. Before we explore how the Romans turned religion and marriage into legal blueprints, make sure you've liked this video and subscribed. I'm curious. Which of these Roman control tactics feels the most relatable to our modern world? Let me know in the comments. In Rome, religion wasn't a matter of spiritual vibes, it was a public safety system. If you performed a ritual correctly, the gods maintained order. If you messed it up, the gods got annoyed, and suddenly the city was on fire, crops were failing, and everyone was hunting for whoever angered Jupiter. Obsessive precision: every sacrifice and prayer had to be perfect. The wrong word, a slip of the hand, or even the wrong animal could invalidate the whole thing. Half-pleasing a god was considered more dangerous than not trying at all. Legally binding vows: private citizens weren't off the hook. If you made a promise to a deity and failed to deliver, the state could fine or shame you. Rome had no meteorologists or epidemiologists, so divine displeasure was the most logical explanation for a disaster. Behavior over belief: Rome didn't care what you believed in your heart. Belief was optional, participation was mandatory. You could privately doubt the gods all you wanted, as long as your public ritual was flawless. To Rome, keeping the gods happy wasn't theology, it was infrastructure. Rome understood that a convincing speaker in the wrong place could do more damage than a foreign army. Words were treated like sharp, contagious tools. Authorized speech only. You couldn't just stand in a public square and address a crowd. That was suspicious behavior. Unauthorized speeches were treated as potential threats, especially if they used emotional language or promised to fix everything. Boredom over bloodshed: Rome preferred calm, measured rhetoric. If your speech made people feel too much, the authorities started paying attention. They didn't want to silence debate, they wanted to stop debate from mutating into a riot. The "hear me out" risk. Spontaneous crowds were viewed with absolute distrust. Rome knew that revolutions often begin with one charismatic person saying, "Hear me out," and they weren't about to let an unpredictable orator burn the republic down. Adultery in Rome wasn't a private relationship issue, it was a public threat. Rome didn't ask if you were happy, they asked, will this cause legal chaos in 3 generations? The legitimacy crisis. In a society built on lineage and inheritance, knowing exactly whose bloodline was whose was vital. Adultery introduced uncertainty. Who inherits the estate? Which family gains power? One affair could unravel generations of legal planning. The double standard: men were tolerated in their affairs with enslaved people because those children didn't threaten inheritance lines. But a married woman's affair triggered legal intervention. It wasn't about heartbreak. It was about restoring order before gossip turned into lawsuits and lawsuits turned into violence. The economic guardrail: Rome knew that if the wealthy were left to compete in fashion wars, they would bankrupt themselves just to outflex each other at dinner. Limiting the color was the Senate's way of saying, please stop before this gets stupid. To the Romans, dramatic grief was treated like an uncontrolled fire hazard. They weren't emotionally repressed robots, they were survivalists. They understood a terrifying psychological truth: public emotion spreads faster than logic. When one person screamed in a Roman street, 10 more joined. When a crowd gathered, the city prepared for a riot. To prevent this emotional contagion, the law stepped in to regulate the theater of sorrow. Professional mourners: yes, you could hire people to wail and tear their hair out. But the government capped their volume and the length of their performance. Gendered restrictions: women were specifically forbidden from excessive displays. No theatrical collapsing, no ripping out clumps of hair. The crowd control logic: this wasn't about suppressing love for the dead, it was about preventing a funeral from turning into a political protest. In a city buzzing with rivalries, a loud funeral was like an open flame in a grain warehouse. The Roman philosophy: uncontrolled emotion doesn't stay personal for long. It turns political, and political emotion can burn an empire down faster than any invading army. Finally, we have the sumptuary laws. In Rome, dinner was never just a meal, it was psychological warfare served on a silver platter. Rich Romans used banquets the way modern influencers use luxury lifestyle posts. They competed to see who could serve the rarest exotic birds or the most expensive imported spices. Rome realized that if the elite spent all their time and money trying to outfeast one another, the social fabric would tear. The laws strictly limited how much you could spend on a single meal, how many guests you were allowed to invite. Sanitation as survival: in a city of over 1 million people, hygiene was a matter of national security. Rome treated bathroom behavior as a public health issue. You didn't linger, you didn't splash, and you definitely didn't treat the latrine like a performance venue. The shared sponge: yes, they used a shared sponge on a stick, tersorium, rinsed in salt water. While we recoil today, Romans, lacking germ theory, believed the salt water was perfectly hygienic. The value of waste. Rome was the king of recycling. Human waste was gathered and sold for tanning leather and fertilizing crops. Stealing from a latrine could actually result in a fine. Rome didn't care about your comfort, it cared that you didn't die of a preventable plague. In Rome, the night wasn't for romantic strolls, it was for bad decisions. Once the sun dipped, the city became a labyrinth of shadows, poorly lit streets, and high-stakes conspiracy. Because most fires and thefts happened under the cover of darkness, Rome adopted a guilty until proven daylight policy. If you were caught walking around at night without a very good excuse, patrols assumed you were up to no good. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. Rome understood that order is fragile, and it only takes one person with a torch or a grudge to burn an empire down. In the shadows of the Colosseum and beneath the grand arches of the Forum, ancient Rome operated on a single, unwavering principle: unpredictability is the enemy. Whether it was how you walked at night, how you chose to die, or whose sweat you rubbed on your face, the law was always watching. Rome didn't just want to rule the world, it wanted to rule you. The loophole game: of course, the Romans hated these laws. They complained constantly: reclassified foods, is a dormouse a luxury or a snack, and hosted, technically legal, dinners that violated every spirit of the law. This was a centuries-long dance of regulation and rebellion, all to stop dinner from becoming a political arms race. Of all Roman rules, this next one usually makes people stop reading and just stare at the wall for a minute. In Roman society, the Pater Familias, the male head of the household, held extraordinary, almost terrifying legal power. We aren't just talking about kids. This authority extended over adult sons, daughters, grandchildren, slaves, and property. You could be a 40-year-old war hero with your own children and graying hair, and you were still legally under your father's thumb. The power of life and death. In the early periods, the Pater Familias technically held the vitae nescisque potestas. The power of life and death over his family. Efficiency over feelings. Rome viewed the family as a miniature state. Their philosophy was simple: every state needs one ruler, not a committee or a group chat. They prioritized efficiency and accountability over fairness. The burden of leadership. If your household fell into debt or scandal, Rome didn't care about your excuses. The father was legally responsible for every crime and debt under his roof. It was a system designed to build predictable households, not happy ones. Ancient Rome gave us roads, concrete, and empires, but they also gave us the most social bathroom experience in history. Imagine a long stone bench with evenly spaced holes and 0 stalls. Everyone sat side by side, conducting business while chatting about the latest chariot races. This wasn't a social failure, it was Roman efficiency. The financial penalty: if you died without approval, the state could confiscate your entire estate. Dying irresponsibly was considered financially rude to your family and your creditors. Rome preferred sadness with paperwork over chaos without it. Rome didn't fear women, it feared what unchecked beauty did to political stability. Visible luxury was viewed as an arms race that could bankrupt the elite. Damage control: one gold necklace invited a larger one. One gown demanded an even more outrageous import. Rome saw this flexing and realized that when rich families spend all their money on status symbols, they turn to corruption to refill their coffers. Visual hierarchy: clothing signaled marital status and moral expectations. Excessive display suggested independence, and in the Roman mind, independence meant unpredictability. The cycle of rebellion. Women found creative loopholes, layering jewelry or exaggerating hairstyles when the laws got too strict. Men complained, then admired the results, and the cycle continued for centuries. It was never about modesty, it was about preventing social life from becoming a financial blood sport. To us, gladiators are superstars. To the Roman law, they were infames, legally dishonorable persons. They were the original influencers, but they lived in a legal basement. The status firewall. Gladiators lost the right to vote, hold office, or even have their testimony fully trusted in court. Rome loved the spectacle but hated the idea of a professional killer becoming a civic hero. Admire, don't imitate. By keeping gladiators legally degraded, Rome prevented ambitious young men from abandoning the army to chase arena glory. The weirdest cosmetic: despite their dishonorable status, Romans were obsessed. They collected gladiator souvenirs and even used gladiator sweat as a face cream. Rome simply refused to let that obsession turn into actual political power. The tension snapped in a moment of violent psychological crisis. Vincent mutilated his own ear, Gauguin fled, and the Yellow House was stripped of its hope. Even from his hospital bed, however, Vincent kept painting. Alls had given him his most vivid colors, and his deepest wounds. Voluntarily entering the asylum at Saint Remy, Vincent found a fragile, forced order. Confinement narrowed his world, leaving only the battle in his mind and the window to the sky. The swirling rhythms. Between bouts of hallucinations and confusion, he painted with manic focus. The garden, the olive trees, and the cypresses became pulsing, rhythmic forces. Controlled explosions: these weren't peaceful paintings, they were attempts to impose order on inner chaos. From his barred window, he painted a sky that didn't just sit there, it breathed, twisted, and roared under unseen pressure. He wasn't painting a fantasy. He was painting the way the world felt when you were finally brave enough to look it in the eye. Vincent van Gogh didn't paint because he was happy, he painted because he was honest. In the asylum at Saint Remy, he discovered a brutal truth: art doesn't require a stable mind, it requires an unwavering gaze. The asylum stripped him of the illusions of a normal life, leaving him with nothing but raw sensation and memory. He wasn't painting despite his storms. He was painting through them, stroke by rhythmic stroke. When he finally settled in Auvers-sur-Oise, the world saw a man in recovery. He was closer to his brother Theo, under the watchful eye of a physician, and surrounded by the open, breathing countryside. But for Vincent, this wasn't peace, it was a high-speed chase. He painted relentlessly, sometimes finishing a canvas in a single sitting. His style had reached its peak. Vibrating lines, colors that felt like a pulse, and landscapes that felt expansive yet claustrophobically unsettled. Romans took funerals so seriously they had to regulate them to stop them from becoming competitive theater. The arms race of grief, wealthy families used the dead as props. More professional wailers, more expensive coffins, more musicians. It was a social flex that bankrupted families and led to massive, agitated crowds in the streets. Preventing the funeral riot, large, emotional processions often turned political. A funeral could easily morph into a protest. By limiting extravagance, Rome ensured that grief remained a family matter, not a citywide event that could ignite unrest. When a slave was freed in Rome, they didn't just walk into the sunset. They became a freedman, legally free, but bound to their former master, now called their patron. Stable dependence, this was a compromise to prevent social chaos. Rome didn't want thousands of new citizens with no support networks. Freed people owed their patrons loyalty and service. In exchange, patrons provided legal protection and social access. Controlled transition, this system allowed for limited social mobility while ensuring the elites kept their voting blocs and influence. It was freedom with terms and conditions, because Rome understood that liberty without structure tends to explode. Rome's relentless logic was simple: if enough individuals make bad choices, society collapses. They regulated morality, behavior, and routine not because they were petty, but because they were allergic to instability. Rome's obsession with control wasn't a micromanagement of joy, it was a desperate attempt to outrun entropy. They saw the patterns: private debt leads to public feuds, feuds lead to civil war, and civil war ends with a new set of laws written by whoever is left standing among the rubble. Rome preferred to skip the bloodshed. To them, behavior modification wasn't tyranny. It was preventative maintenance. Beneath the immense output of his final months, the ground was shifting. Vincent's stability was tied to Theo, and when Theo began to struggle with his own health and finances, Vincent felt the crushing weight of being a lifelong burden. The invisible wall, despite a few flickers of critical interest, recognition remained abstract. It didn't provide security, it didn't pay the bills. The confession on canvas, his final paintings weren't peaceful observations of nature. They were fields under pressure, skies in motion, and paths that split and vanished into nowhere. They were confessions of a man who could no longer find a place to rest. The ritual of exhaustion: each morning, he walked into the fields with his easel, each evening, he returned silent. This wasn't the silence of peace, but a dense, heavy silence that pressed inward. Painting had stopped offering relief, it only offered postponement. The sadness will never end. These were Vincent's final, resigned words to Theo. In late July 1890, the decision was made. It wasn't an act of madness, but a tired conclusion to years of negotiating with pain. He shot himself in a wheat field, managed to walk back to his room, and died 2 days later at age 37. His coffin was covered in the sunflowers he had immortalized. The world barely blinked. It would take the fierce dedication of Theo's widow, Johanna, to show the world that Vincent wasn't a failure. He was a pioneer who had arrived too early. While Vincent was silencing his inner noise in France, a different kind of sound was erupting in the humid streets of New Orleans. This wasn't a city that waited for culture to arrive, it was a city that manufactured it through the sheer force of collision. The state didn't trust the individual. Why would it? Humans are driven by pride, desire, and impulsive fury, all of which are radioactive to a stable empire. So, Rome built a cage of rules. It worked for centuries, managing millions of people without a single computer or telegraph. They traded modern freedom for predictability, and that predictability kept the machine from grinding to a halt. When we judge these laws today, we often forget that Rome wasn't trying to be humane. It was trying to survive. And for a long time, the answer was a resounding yes. While Rome sought to regulate the external world, centuries later, a man named Vincent van Gogh was born into a world where the internal noise was impossible to silence. Born in 1853 in Zundert, a quiet Dutch village, Vincent's very arrival was steeped in symbolic weight. He was born on the exact same day, 1 year later, as a stillborn brother also named Vincent. Imagine walking past a headstone with your own name on it every Sunday. This haunting realization, that he was essentially a replacement, colored his identity with a fragile, accidental quality. His father was a strict Protestant pastor, his mother was an artist who arranged nature with careful hands. From his father, he took a moral intensity, from his mother, a sensitivity to the vibrations of color. Vincent was never a cheerful child. He didn't play, he stared. He watched people the way sailors watched the horizon, trying to decipher patterns in a social world that felt like a set of instructions he hadn't been given. After a failed stint as an art dealer, where he grew so disgusted by the commercialization of sacred art that he was eventually fired, he spiraled. He tried to be a teacher, a preacher, and a martyr. He gave away his clothes to minors and slept on dirt floors. Each attempt ended in the same crushing silence of rejection. By his late 20s, he was broke and exhausted, but the hunger was sharpening. He didn't pick up a brush out of a dream, he picked it up because he had nowhere else to go. Painting was Vincent's last stand. He didn't aim for beauty, he aimed for honesty. He started with the people he understood, the laborers with bent backs and worn faces. His early work was muddy and dark, as if light had to fight to exist on the canvas. The lifeline, his brother Theo became his emotional and financial anchor. Their letters reveal a man constantly asking if suffering was simply the admission price for seeing the world clearly. The search for truth, Vincent rejected academic polish. He wanted the ugly truth. He fell in love recklessly, was rejected consistently, and felt fundamentally misaligned with humanity. The real transformation happened when Vincent moved to Paris. The city was a sensory assault, exposing him to the impressionists who treated light as a subject, not an accessory. For Vincent, color wasn't a style, it was a revelation. The palette shift, his earthy, dark tones exploded. Yellows burned, blues vibrated. The battlefield, he stopped smoothing his edges and began attacking the canvas. Painting became a physical confrontation. He realized a field didn't need to look like a field if it felt like one. The unstable genius, he painted multiple works a week, drank heavily, and worked until collapse. He was no longer searching for a purpose. He had found it, even as it began to consume him. Seeking clarity, Vincent fled to Arles in the south of France. He rented a small house with yellow walls, envisioning an artist's house where creativity could thrive without the poison of loneliness. Under the Arles sun, his work became electric. Sunflowers and bedrooms took on a strange, heavy gravity. But Vincent's dream of a collective required people, and he was notoriously difficult. When Paul Gauguin arrived, the two clashed immediately. Gauguin was controlled, Vincent was an exposed nerve. Beneath the immense output of his final months, the ground was shifting. Vincent's stability was tied to Theo, and when Theo began to struggle with his own health and finances, Vincent felt the crushing weight of being a lifelong burden. The invisible wall, despite a few flickers of critical interest, recognition remained abstract. It didn't provide security, it didn't pay the bills. The Confession on canvas, his final paintings weren't peaceful observations of nature. They were fields under pressure, skies in motion, and paths that split and vanished into nowhere. They were confessions of a man who could no longer find a place to rest. The ritual of exhaustion: each morning, he walked into the fields with his easel; each evening, he returned silent. This wasn't the silence of peace, but a dense, heavy silence that pressed inward. Painting had stopped offering relief, it only offered postponement. The sadness will never end. These were Vincent's final, resigned words to Theo. In late July 1890, the decision was made. It wasn't an act of madness, but a tired conclusion to years of negotiating with pain. He shot himself in a wheat field, managed to walk back to his room, and died 2 days later at age 37. His coffin was covered in the sunflowers he had immortalized. The world barely blinked. It would take the fierce dedication of Theo's widow, Johanna, to show the world that Vincent wasn't a failure. He was a pioneer who had arrived too early. While Vincent was silencing his inner noise in France, a different kind of sound was erupting in the humid streets of New Orleans. This wasn't a city that waited for culture to arrive, it was a city that manufactured it through the sheer force of collision. At the turn of the 20th century, New Orleans was unlike any other place on earth. It was a pressure cooker of French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American influences. These cultures didn't blend smoothly, they rubbed against each other until they sparked. That friction produced a heat, and that heat produced jazz. In New Orleans, music wasn't entertainment, it was the air you breathed. Congo Square, this was the heartbeat. On Sundays, enslaved and formerly enslaved black people gathered to drum and dance. These weren't performances, they were acts of survival. They preserved rhythms that were never supposed to make it across the Atlantic. No boundaries, brass bands marched for weddings and funerals in the same afternoon. Church hymns fused with African call and response. Docks echoed with work songs that kept time for the body while freeing the mind. The death of purity. New Orleans didn't care about proper music. You could borrow, bend, and distort. Mistakes weren't failures, they were the beginning of an improvisation. Jazz emerged from people who had everything taken from them except their rhythm. It was forged in the docks and fields where work songs gave voice to endurance. It was refined in the dance halls and funeral processions where sorrow was turned into a communal celebration. Unlike the rest of a segregated America, New Orleans allowed these musical practices to breathe in public. Black musicians played openly, blending European structure and brass instruments with the raw, emotional truth of African memory. Jazz didn't begin as a movement or a rebellion. It rose from the warm ground like humidity, an inevitable response to a city that refused to be silent. It was the sound of humanity refusing to be reduced to a number, an echo of the same honesty Vincent sought on his canvas, but played through a horn, in the middle of a street, for anyone who cared to listen. The transition from the cemetery to the street in New Orleans was a transformation of the soul. On the way to the grave, the music was slow, a heavy, mournful conversation with the inevitable. But on the way back, the rhythm turned defiant. Death didn't end the music, it sharpened the focus. This was the birth of a language where pain wasn't hidden, it was shaped, stretched, and released through the blues. It was an emotional vocabulary of bent notes and unresolved tension, proving that while words often fail, a trumpet never has to. By the end of the 19th century, jazz began to find its first mythic heroes. These weren't conservatory-trained virtuosos, they were barbers, dock workers, and laborers. Among them was Buddy Bolden, a cornet player whose sound was so massive it reportedly carried across neighborhoods. Bolden didn't care about technical precision, he cared about feeling. He took the rigid structure of a military march and injected it with a dangerous, unpredictable swing. Under his influence, melodies stopped being fixed objects. A tune became a playground where instruments didn't just play together, they talked. Collective improvisation, the cornet led, the clarinet twisted around the lead, and the trombone growled from below. Storyville, much of this evolution happened in New Orleans' legalized red light district. In the bars and brothels of Storyville, musicians learned the ultimate professional skill, how to read a room. If the crowd wanted heat, they turned the air into fire. New Orleans could not contain this energy forever. Between 1910 and 1970, the Great Migration saw approximately 6 million black Americans move from the rural South to the northern industrial cities to escape Jim Crow violence and seek economic opportunity. Musicians carried their sound like a passport. In Chicago, the New Orleans style tightened, giving way to sharper, more aggressive solos. In New York, particularly Harlem, jazz became the heartbeat of a cultural revolution. If New Orleans gave jazz its bones, Louis Armstrong gave it a spine and a face. Born into agonizing poverty, Armstrong learned the cornet in a reform home, a moment of discipline that became his destiny. Before Armstrong, jazz was mostly a group effort. He brought the individual to the front of the stage. His solos weren't just breaks, they were narratives told with a bold, clear tone that you could recognize in a crowded room. The invention of swing, Armstrong didn't just follow the beat. He danced with it. He created a feeling of swing that made the music breathe rather than march. Scat singing, he treated his gravelly voice like a horn, proving that in jazz, expression matters more than perfection. As the music moved into the 1930s, it scaled up. The big band era arrived, and at the center of it was Duke Ellington. Ellington didn't try to make jazz respectable by mimicking European classical music. He proved jazz was already worthy of the grandest stages. He wrote for specific personalities, shaping arrangements around the unique voice of his players. In his hands, jazz became orchestral but remained intimate. It was no longer just something you danced to, it was something you listened to. Success brought a new kind of pressure. As jazz dominated the radio waves, the industry demanded consistency and repetition, the two things jazz was born to resist. The struggle. Musicians had to navigate the gap between staying inventive and satisfying a commercial market that wanted the same hits every night. The spirit, despite the fame and the recording contracts, the core of jazz remained a music of presence. It was created in the moment, shaped by who was in the room and how they felt. Jazz had officially arrived, complex, confident, and self-aware. But even as it wore its crown in the grandest ballrooms of New York, it never forgot the humid, high-friction streets of New Orleans where it first learned how to breathe. By the late 1930s, jazz was in danger of becoming safe. Swing was the king of the airwaves, profitable and polished, but to a new generation of musicians, it felt like a gilded cage. Jazz has always been allergic to confinement, and in the smoky backrooms of after-hours clubs, it decided to break its own neck. Musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie began experimenting with tempos that were too fast for dancing and harmonies that were too complex for easy listening. This was bebop. It wasn't about entertaining a crowd, it was a fierce, intellectual confrontation. The shift, improvisation moved from being decorative to being a high-speed, dense conversation. Self-defense, bebop was an assertion of autonomy. These musicians weren't entertainers on command, they were artists playing for each other. The vulnerable path, while bebop was cerebral, vocalists like Billie Holiday were stripping jazz down to its raw, emotional marrow. She proved that jazz could be a living language of both explosive intellect and devastating honesty. By the mid-20th century, jazz fractured into 1,000 directions. Miles Davis became the avatar of risk, constantly destroying his own sound to build something new, moving from cool jazz to electric fusion. Meanwhile, John Coltrane pushed the music inward, turning a saxophone solo into a spiritual inquiry, a sheets of sound approach that felt like a storm of devotion. More than just music, jazz became a language of resistance. In a world defined by segregation, playing free was a political act. To bend a structure was to question authority. Jazz didn't need slogans, its very form was a defiance of the status quo. Just as jazz would later test the boundaries of cultural freedom, the young United States faced its first existential crisis in the 1790s. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, and for farmers in western Pennsylvania, the federal government felt like a distant, meddling question mark. On the frontier, whiskey wasn't a drink, it was infrastructure. Money in a bottle, grain was too heavy to haul over muddy mountain roads. Distilling it into whiskey made it compact, durable, and valuable. In a world without cash, whiskey paid the doctor, settled debts, and bought supplies. Survival, to tax whiskey was to reach directly into the rhythm of survival. For a farmer, a tax on spirits was a tax on his ability to exist. Alexander Hamilton didn't create the whiskey tax by accident. He needed to pay off Revolutionary War debts, but more importantly, he needed to prove that the federal government was real. To Hamilton, a law that couldn't be enforced was just a suggestion. The uneven burden, the tax favored large eastern distillers who could pay flat fees. Small western farmers were hit harder per gallon. The intrusion, federal tax collectors became symbols of tyranny. They demanded cash that didn't exist and records that farmers didn't know how to keep. Resistance didn't start with guns, it started with doubt. Farmers petitioned Philadelphia, but when the government refused to budge, the whiskey boys turned to more visceral methods. Tax collectors were harassed, mocked, and, in the ultimate echo of the revolution, tarred and feathered. To the rebels, they were defending the spirit of 1776. To Hamilton, they were a threat to the survival of the Republic. If the government backed down now, the experiment would fracture before it truly began. By 1793, the taverns and fields of Pennsylvania were buzzing with more than just spirits, they were brewing a revolution. The frontier had decided, if the law didn't respect their survival, they wouldn't respect the law.